Thunder and Lightning. There were some big black clouds in the sky as Pat set out on Friday morning. "Looks stormy today," he said to Jess. There was some crackling on the radio. "And that sounds like lightning somewhere. Don't worry, Jess. It won't hurt you." But Jess wasn't too sure. When they arrived at the post office, there was a rumble of thunder that seemed to go banging from one end of Greendale to the other. Jess went to hide in a mailbag and wouldn't even come out to say hello to Mrs. Goggins. "You'll get posted to London if you stay in that bag, young Jess," said Mrs. Goggins. "And that'll be worse than a bit of thunder in Greendale." But Jess wouldn't come out. By the time Pat reached Greendale Farm, the clouds had rolled back and the sun had come out. Mrs. Pottage was putting her washing out to dry. "You'd better keep an eye on that weather," said Pat. "There was a rumble of thunder earlier on." "Oh, that's all right. I'll get the twins to keep a watch out for me," said Mrs. Pottage. "Aren't they at school today?" said Pat. "No, they're off with a bad cold. They both started last night," said Mrs. Pottage. "But they're well enough to keep an eye on the weather through the window." "Jess doesn't like it one bit," said Pat. "When he heard that thunder, he hid in one of my bags, and I haven't seen so much as his nose since. Do you think the twins would like to play with him? He might be better off staying with you for the day." "I'm sure they would," said Mrs. Pottage. "Why don't you ask them?" Pat put his head in at the door, and there were Katy and Tom sitting snug on the settee by the warm stove, with red noses and a box of paper hankies. "Would you like Jess to come and play with you?" said Pat. "Oh, yes, please," said Katy. "Achoo," said Tom. "Will he catch our cold?" said Katy. "No," said Pat. "Cats don't catch human colds. He'll be fine if only I can get him out of that bag." Pat went to his van. "Come on, Jess. You can stay with the twins today," he said in a coaxing voice, but Jess didn't move. "I know you're in there somewhere," said Pat. He reached into the bag, and Jess gave him a scratch. "Ouch!" said Pat. "You naughty puss." He picked the bag up and gently tipped Jess out of it. "Now, no more scratching, or you'll have to stay with me and face the thunder and lightning," said Pat. Jess didn't put his claws out when Pat carried him into the house. When he saw the twins and the warm stove and the woolly rug, he began to purr. "Would you like some nice creamy milk, Jess, love?" said Mrs. Pottage. Jess rubbed against her legs and purred louder than ever. "He'll be all right with us," said Mrs. Pottage. "I'll call back for him this afternoon," said Pat. Pat went on his way. It seemed odd to be without Jess, and Pat missed him. "Still," he said to himself, "he'll be better off indoors today, like Katy and Tom." There was another thumping, bumping noise in the sky, and more crackling on the radio. Pat thought he saw a flicker of lightning as he stopped at the church. "Lightning," said the Reverend Timms. "The good Lord will protect us. Besides, we have a lightning conductor on the church tower. See, there it is." There was a bright flash of lightning and a loud roll of thunder. Big drops of rain began to plop down. "All the same," said Pat, "I think we'd better get indoors. That sounded a bit too near for me. Besides, we're getting wet. That conductor thing isn't much good at keeping the rain off." Pat counted out 7 letters and a small parcel for the Reverend Timms. "I'll be on my way now," said Pat. "Cheerio." "Mind how you go," said the Reverend. Pat met Sam Waldron up the road. They stopped for a chat. The lightning was getting worse. "I'm not scared of lightning," said Sam, "but I'm not daft enough to shelter under a tree. That would be asking for trouble." "But the mail must get through," said Pat. "And the carrots and potatoes," said Sam. "I once knew a man," said Pat, "who was struck by lightning as he was crossing a field. It drew a line all down the middle of his body, from top to toe, and melted the nails in his boots. It gave him a fright, but it didn't hurt him at all." "Well, I never," said Sam. "We'd better be on our way before it gets too bad," said Pat. "Cheerio." "Cheerio." Granny Dryden had left her washing out in the rain. Pat gathered it up and took it in with the post. "Gracious me! I didn't know it was raining," cried Granny Dryden, switching on her hearing aid. "Didn't you hear the thunder?" said Pat. "No, I'd switched off to save that battery you gave me, Pat. I want to be able to hear properly tonight. They're showing Princess Di on the television." "It's a proper storm," said Pat. "It's thundering and lightning like a fireworks display." "Then I'd rather not hear it," said Granny Dryden. "I'll switch it off when you've gone. Put that wet washing in that basket over there, Pat, and could you just give me a hand to get these mirrors covered up?" Granny Dryden rushed round to cover every mirror with a sheet or a towel. "Why do you want to do that?" said Pat. "To keep the lightning away," she said. "Well, I never," said Pat. "I don't see how that's going to help." But he helped her just the same. As he left, she switched her hearing aid off and settled down by the fire to read a letter from her daughter. She would take no more notice of the storm. At Thompson Ground, Dorothy Thompson had shut all the hens in the henhouse, and Pat could hear them cackling and fluttering about. "They're in a right proper tizzy," said Dorothy Thompson, "with this storm brewing up." "As bad as our Jess," said Pat. "They'll be laying square eggs if it gets any worse." When Pat arrived at Ted Glenn's house, he was sitting at the window watching the storm. "I love watching lightning," he said, "as long as I'm in a safe place." There was a tremendous flash and bang together, and the tree behind Ted's house came crashing to the ground. "Help!" shouted Pat. "You're all right," said Ted, "but my tree isn't, and my aerial's come down with it. I won't be able to listen to Radio Scotland now." "I'm off," said Pat, "before anything else falls down." And Pat ran to his van through the bucketing rain. It was time to go and collect Jess, and then to go home. Pat called back at Greendale Farm for him. There he was, being petted and cuddled by Tom, whilst Katy fed him the best pieces of fish from her plate. "He'll never want to come home if you make such a fuss of him," said Pat. "And just look at my wet washing," said Mrs. Pottage. "I thought you had twin lookouts for the rain," said Pat. "So did I," said Mrs. Pottage, "but they were so busy playing with Jess that they never saw the rain." "So it's all Jess's fault, then," said Pat. "No, bless him, we mustn't blame Jess. He's been as good as gold," said Mrs. Pottage. "Well, thanks for looking after him so well. The thunder's gone away now, Jess," said Pat, "so you won't need to ride home in a mailbag. Come on, time to go home." Pat tucked Jess into his jacket and took him home. The sun was coming out and the black rain clouds were rolling away. Jess thought there might be time for a spot of mousing after tea.